All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This here is an educational channel. We try to turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, earth-shattering discoveries, and usually coming from obscure sources that you've never heard of before. This is Bible Decode 256, and we're looking at the not very well known Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was actually written by the Romans as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who were in charge of the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And Titus and Vespasian were both generals in the war fought between the Romans and the Jews from 66 until 73 AD. And they were both wounded in the war, and they had seen the history leading up to this, where not all of it, but going back over 100 years, the Jews were the most high maintenance and difficult to manage nation of peoples under the Roman Empire. The Romans felt like the Jews were the highest maintenance, the hardest to deal with. They were always revolting, rebelling, insurrecting, assassinating, using terrorist attacks. And they had this separatist religion with a God with a great amount of personality disorders that led to them having an obsessive amount of rituals and sacrifices that they had to perform in order to mollify this God. And so they had the Sabbath and the circumcision and the sacrifices and the strictures against graven images. And these things were all kind of detrimental to the Romans. And the Jews were willing to die for this, to die to maintain these things. And, you know, the Romans would oblige. The Romans would kill them. But, that would lead to a riot or some other kind of difficult encounter, in some cases a full-on insurrection or revolt or even a war. And that's what happened in 66 AD. Some really self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs rose up in Jerusalem and expelled the Roman puppet king, Herod Agrippa II. Sent him back to Rome. And the Jewish expectation or anticipation for the military Messiah who was going to lead the lead the Jews against the Romans, actually came to fruition here in 66 AD. But it was short-lived. Eventually, Herod Agrippa got back to Rome, and Nero sent in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And this Roman civil war was going on, and so it really started in kind of the assassination plots of Nero, and he got so paranoid that he ended up either being killed or killing himself. And then there was a series of 3 consecutive emperors that were appointed and were assassinated within 12 months, called the Year of the 4 Emperors, 69 AD in Rome. And the end of that was Emperor General Vespasian being announced to be the new emperor. So Vespasian left his post as a general in this army and turned over the reins to his son Titus while he went back to Rome to be the pope. I mean, to be the emperor. Same thing, basically. And what's interesting is that then, Titus kept fighting, and it took 3 more years. So really almost 7 years to put down the Jews. And so that's really the motive for the Romans. They were, even though Titus utterly destroyed Jerusalem and decimated the Jews, they knew that the Jews were going to come back resilient because they have been doing that for over 100 years. And so they felt like they reached into their bag of tricks of psychological operations for purposes of psychological warfare. And they had created other religions in the past for the same purpose. This wasn't like a one and done kind of thing. They did the same thing against a different group of Jews in what's known as rabbinical Judaism. That's a Flavian thing as well. The Flavian emperors. And Flavian, by the way, means blonde or golden. And so they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who, instead of being a military commander, was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek to oppression, calling out that the Roman centurion slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, while at the very same time, this Messiah was overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the Jewish temple and castigating the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice inside the Jewish temple, and encouraging his disciples to abandon their families to follow him. And so this is a Jesus who is incredibly deferential to the Romans, and at the same time being incredibly, attacking on the Jews, and in particular attacking on their traditions, their family life, their practices, their history. And then you get further along into the Pauline epistles, and Paul is even more pro-Roman and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. But that's just really the circumstantial evidence. The motive and the MO and the means and the opportunity were really possessed only by the Romans, given that they had full censorship powers and full publishing powers and distribution through their own mail service. So they were really the only people who could have written the New Testament when you look at it that way. Also, the New Testament's written in Greek, one of the 2 staple languages of the Romans, along with Latin for the royals, unlike what was going on in Judea, where they were Aramaic speakers and only the upper crust would speak Greek, and very few of them knew how to read, much less write. There's certainly a lot of evidence given by some of these scholars that pursue the Roman origins hypothesis that the Gospels were really written originally as plays to be performed in front of people. And that this family called the Piso family wrote themselves into the script. So, the main author and the father, Arius Piso, was like, he played the role of Jesus. And he also played the role of Satan and a few other people, while his sons played the roles of the disciples. So, most people didn't know how to read even in Rome. And so, the way that you're going to be able to convert people to this is by, reading it out loud to them. Anyway, further along in this theory is the actual evidence from the text, from the scriptures, from the Gospels. But in order to really read the Gospels, you need to read it alongside another book that the Romans wrote at this same time, which is a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews, called the War of the Jews, or Jewish War, which was written under the name of Josephus, or Josephus. And Josephus was a shady character. I don't know exactly who he was, or if he was a team of people, or more than one person, or a family of people, or if he was just a pseudonym of Arius Piso. But he wrote an autobiography, and in his autobiography, he claims that he was a Jewish military commander who surrendered to Vespasian. And upon doing so, he recognized that God favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. And then he predicted that, or prophesied, that one day Vespasian would become the new emperor. And when he did, when Vespasian became the new emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome to become one of the court historians, set him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. So now he is known as Flavius Josephus. And so, regardless of what you think of that, a very dubious story, we pretty much know that Josephus, whoever he was written under the auspices of the Romans, yet he emanated from Rome. Titus was in full enthusiastic endorsement of the 7-volume War of the Jews. Now, what happens when you read War of the Jews alongside the Gospels, and you kind of know what you're looking for, the amount of parallels between the two will literally pop off the page, especially if you're reading Luke, or the book of Luke, which is much shorter than War of the Jews. War of the Jews is about as long as the Old Testament. And so it's much longer than the New Testament, but especially just one book, one gospel book, the book of Luke. Michael Menescotts looked into the book of Luke, looking for parallels with War of the Jews, and found over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And many of them are very detailed, intricate, and involved, and well hidden. But once you know what you're looking for, it's like, whoa. And then it's kind of like you can see the intentionality, and you can see the mean-spiritedness among the Romans and the hatred that they had for the Jews. And they are just ridiculing and mocking and demeaning and, really just trying to humiliate the Jews. when you read them together. And then some of the parallels are so strong that you even just by themselves they get to the point where it's beyond coincidental. But then when you see over 250 of them, you could probably dismiss a few of them. Say you can dismiss 50 of them because they're coincidental. You still have 200 of them left. And so, and then Michael Menescot's in his book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy cult, he graphed all of the parallels on a chart. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plotted a point for every place that there was a parallel. And he formed 5 almost perfect letters in Latin. APTVS, Titus Vespasian. Arius Piso, maybe. Titus and Vespasian. So basically the Romans literally signed their name on the book of Luke. And, they wanted to be discovered eventually for having done this. Not in their lifetimes, but eventually for posterity's purposes. And I think that they would be shocked to think that almost 2,000 years later, people still haven't figured it out. But it's coming because it's overwhelming in terms of the evidence. Also, Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah that came out in 2005, he shows over 40 separate events where the ministry of Jesus is a replica of the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes, or vice versa, because Titus is the actual historical figure here. So every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. They go to these places in the same order, and at each place they encounter parallel events that are spaced out by exactly 40 years. So 40 separate events, more than 40. Anyway, we're looking at some other books here that kind of skirt around the Roman origins hypothesis and bring in some maybe other information. They're authors who maybe are not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis, so they're just kind of scratching the surface of it, but they don't see it in its enormity. But this one is interesting because it also brings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, were really the only other text that was written besides Josephus and the New Testament that really describes life and history in the first century in any kind of detail. And so this book is called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians by Robert Eisenman. And we're looking at a chapter that is in here. This is a compendium, or I don't know what the right word is for. It's a bunch of different essays and a couple of his shorter books that are all in this book. And we're dealing with chapter 3, which is a talk he gave in 1987 called The Jerusalem Community of James the Just and the Community at Qumran. James the Just is supposed to be James, the brother of Jesus, and Eisenman sees him as being the real hero. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls has their characters in the Dead Sea Scrolls are often tried to be matched up to the characters of the Bible, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls there is the teacher of righteousness, and then there is the wicked priest, and then there is the liar. And Eisenman contends that the teacher of righteousness was James the Just, and that the liar was Paul. while someone like Barbara Eisenman believes that the teacher of righteousness was John the Baptist and the liar was Jesus. So those are interesting questions. But we're going to take over here, hopefully in striking distance, so we can finish this chapter and move on to the next one. He's looking at a lot of the different language that's used in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are mainly translations of the earliest translations of Old Testament material. But there is a lot of sectarian material that is specific to this sect of people living at Qumran, about 20 miles southeast of Jerusalem. And so he's looking at a lot of the language also in the letter of James, and maybe somewhat in the Talmud and in the some of the Apocrypha that uses kind of the similar language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, the three nets in question are those of riches, fornication, and pollution of the temple. The charge of riches, while also central to the scheme of the letter of James, as indeed fornication is, and all subsequent Ebionite history, is not crucial to the analysis because it can presumably be leveled against any establishment by its adversaries at any time and any place. In the case of James's criticism of the establishment, however, it is a central thesis. And in relation to the Herodians, the Herods, to whom the high priest owed their appointment, the theme of their excessive riches is equally persistent. Fornication is precisely, if tendentiously, defined at Qumran and relates to two key matters: marriage with nieces and divorce. In this context, the marital practices of the contemporary ruling elite were a particular irritant. In the Qumran critique, the former practice, if not the latter, was considered habitual. That is, quote, every man marries the daughter of his brother or sister. There was one elite and one elite only of which this could be said. The Herodian, or the Herods. And yeah, the Herods a lot of times were marrying their nieces or their cousins. It certainly cannot be said of the Maccabeans, and probably not of any earlier elite or ruling family either. Although, Abraham married his sister, and that seemed to be kind of the practice of a lot of the Jewish patriarchs, is that they married their half-sister. They had the same father but a different mother. And I think that tradition also goes back to ancient Egypt, where they either married their sister or half-sister. And it was a lot of times, I think Zechariah Sitchin talks about this quite a bit, but the patriarch had a harem or concubines, and I think because Sitchin talks about it, because it goes back. The tradition goes back to the Anunnaki, or what you call in the Old Testament, they're called the Elohim, and they married their sister, their half sister. Same father, two different mothers, and that was how they were sure that the proper genes were passed along or whatever. So to kind of gang up on the Herodians here, I don't know. But I get the point, but because I'm going back many hundreds and thousands of years further. These changes, or these charges, are further enlarged upon in the temple scroll, so much so that they appear to be aimed specifically at the one establishment, the Herodian. The Damascus document, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus document rails against ruler multiplying wives unto himself. Herod, the original Herod the king, had 10, and the temple scroll introduces a significant section on polluting the temple and polluted offerings in the temple with the Deuteronomic king law, thou shalt not put a foreigner over you. The Herods were foreigners, or they were said to have been foreigners, Idumeans, from south of Judea, although Roman Piso talks about how they were actually Maccabeans. And the Maccabees were like the dynasty of Jews who actually fought back against the ruling power of the Seleucids, the Syrian Greeks, who ruled Judea kind of in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. And so the Maccabeans overthrew them, and they ruled Judea for a century or so, until the Romans came. Thou shalt not put a foreigner over you. If we had not found this commandment reiterated at Qumran, we would have had to postulate it. But it is the conjunction of the criticism of these sexual mores with the charge of pollution of the temple that is crucial for determining the historical provenance of the corpus at Qumran. The Damascus document, in passing from the charge of niece marriage to pollution of the temple, makes the additional accusation that they sleep with women in their periods. In our view, this cannot have been said about the Maccabeans, or for that matter, about any Jewish priesthood. Rather, it is precisely how Herodians like Agrippa I and II, who were brought up in Rome with their easy Hellenized ways, would have been seen at Qumran. Certainly daughters and sisters like Drusilla, who married Felix, and Bernice, Titus's mistress, who was a Maccabean, would have been seen in this way. Not to mention the Herodiases, responsible for the death of John the Baptist and her various sexual and marital infractions, all involving what is called fornication at Qumran. So this is the final problem: polluted persons and polluted gifts and sacrifices in the temple. These same difficulties echo throughout the early Christian corpus. They also constitute the impulse behind the uprising against Rome in 66 AD, which involved the barring of sacrifices and gifts from or on behalf of foreigners in the temple, and the banning of Herodians not only from temple, but from all of Jerusalem as well, and the burning of their palaces. So that's what happened in 66 AD. The zealot Jews, which presumably might have included these people here at Qumran, who didn't seem to be as zealot in terms of violence, but in terms of piousness, piety. But that, these Herodians, including Agrippa II, were their prime reason for one of the prime reasons for them to try to take back Jerusalem. And so they banned the Herodians from the temple and all of Jerusalem. And that's what eventually caused the Romans to quell the revolt, but also eventually to resort to a psychological operation in order to mellow out the Jews, or to tame or to domesticate the Jews. That's the language that they use especially in Josephus's War of the Jews, to a lesser extent in the New Testament. That they use a lot of botanical language like pruning and domesticating, taming, and they do talk a good deal about roots and herbs and stuff like that they're using to tame the Jews. So anyway, that is the end of that chapter. So we'll move on tomorrow, and we're going to be getting into chapter 4, which is called Paul as Herodian. So the last book that we checked out, Operation Messiah, claimed that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans, because they just couldn't handle how pro-Roman and how anti-Jew Paul is. How can you explain this other than he was an intelligence agent of the Romans who faked his conversion on the road to Damascus in order to infiltrate the Jesus movements, especially the Nazarenes under James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. But for some reason, they didn't notice how almost pro-Roman and anti-Jew Jesus is compared to Paul. And so that narrows the scope of their focus. But here, Robert Eisenman is going to be talking about how he believes that Paul is not a Roman agent, but he's a Herod. So they're, the Herod, the Agrippas especially, they were born and raised, I don't know about born, but definitely raised in Rome. They were, Hellenized Jews. And maybe not even Jews, maybe Hellenized Idumeans. But he here is trying to argue that Paul is one of them. And so this is also kind of scratching the surface of the Roman origins hypothesis. And I believe that Robert Eisenman has been eventually presented with Joseph Atwill's theory in Caesar's Messiah, which is kind of the first major book that gets into the Roman origins hypothesis. And I think he's very friendly with the theory. Maybe he doesn't sell out for it. I don't know if Eisenman is still alive or not. He's one of the key figures who actually, freed the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were discovered in the 40s and 50s, and it really took until the early 90s before any scholars really had access to them, other than this small cadre of Dominican, Catholic priests in Europe. And Eisenman was kind of like, "What are you guys going to divulge any of this information at some point?" It's obvious that some of it is very embarrassing to you because you're not attempting to translate and publish this stuff. So it must be embarrassing for a Roman Catholic